Дякую. Ми продовжуємо роботу. Мене звати Роман Вибрановський. Я працюю в українському кризовому медіа.
I work in the UCMC not from the very beginning.
Як журналіст.
As a journalist, as it appeared, and Volodymyr Viatrovych is today the director of the Ukrainian National Institute of National Memory. My question to you is, who were you 5 years ago before, who had you been before you took this post? Before that, I had been a member of I had been a political activist, and I understood when these events started in 12 or 14 that I needed to join somehow this activities in the information realm, cooperating with the people who were among the founders of the media center where we are now. Here is a small video showing you in 2014. It's a question regarding the attitude of the local residents of the Crimean Peninsula. And Mr. Viatrovych says that he does not think that they wanted to ask Mr. Putin for help. That's his view that it was not so. And he refers to the pre-Second World War period, and if we get back to the history of Ukraine, we can see that there was a source of separatist movements with regard to Ukraine. The people who wanted to secede from Ukraine were not related to Putin, and in Mr. Viatrovich's view, the people who wanted to get away from Ukraine belonged to the old Soviet type, and he denies, Mr. Viatrovych denies the fact that any national aspects would played any role in the desire of the population of these regions to secede. And Mr. Viatrovych describes these events as an attempt to restore the former Soviet Union, and he describes that as the long-term process with that started with the opening of the archives in the early 1990s, and then he mentions also the rehabilitation, so to say, of such personalities of the Soviet history as Stalin. And at that time, Vladimir Putin decided to start an offensive, literally an offensive, with the aim of restoring the former Soviet Union. He said once that the breakup of the former Soviet Union was one of the largest geopolitical tragedies of the 20th century. And so for Mr. Viatrovych, there is no doubt that this policies of Mr. Putin was implemented through these events, or in these events rather, was embodied in these events. And Mr. Viatrovych then proceeds by saying that he thinks that there were some previous attempts after the Second World War to associate the Ukrainian Nazi collaborators with Ukrainian national aspect, the development of that Ukrainian national aspect, and so on. Well, I think I was not ashamed to see that video. And if I summarize what we heard, my words that we have heard in that video, were a diagnosis, so to say, of the disease that pervaded or affected the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And I think it's an external threat that that Ukraine confronts now, and there is nothing new about that. It has been happening through the history of different times in different countries, and now it all depends on how well the Ukrainians could mobilize themselves to withstand this external pressure. And I think that what I said 5 years ago was accurate, and I'm not ashamed of saying that. The events of 5 years ago have radically changed Ukrainian society. But doesn't it seem to you that these events made Ukrainian society much less coherent? It has become much more separated. Different categories of the population have started, feeling different feelings due to that policy. Well, certainly it's undoubtedly so that we should get separated from the Soviet type of men, the term coined during perestroika times, the Homo Sovieticus. And the main reason for that, Mr. Viatrovych says, is that he was afraid of getting back to what he described as Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the Russian community. And there were some concerns that there would be civil war in Ukraine, all-out, all-encompassing civil war, national-scale civil war. But it hasn't happened. But what do you think could or should we do if those people whom you describe as Homo Sovieticus, if they allow to come to power, not during the civil war or as a result of the civil war, they would allow to come to power to the people who are in favor of better relations with Russia? And what are you going to do in that case? Well, I think the golden rule is that any authorities in Ukraine cannot be forever. If such people come to power, then we would just wait until they are replaced with different people. And I'd say that today there is already a certain, atmosphere of forgetfulness of what was happening in 2014. And Mr. Viatrovych referred to the loss of the Crimean Peninsula that was given by Mr. Khrushchev in 1953 to the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Before that, it had been a part of the Russian Federation. And whatever elections, Mr. Viatrovych says, we should adhere to our line. As an historian, doesn't it seem to you that when reading different media of different countries, like, for example, Polish media, Hungarian media, we acknowledge that it has become much more difficult for Ukraine to cooperate with these countries that are not to the east but to the west of Ukraine. And that we face, certain hostile attitude vis-à-vis Ukraine on their part. Well, the reason, in my view, is the same, that in these countries there are people who would like to view us as younger brothers, and we can say that we can also attribute it to the fact that there are somewhat authoritarian regimes were established in such countries as Poland and Hungary. But we should be ready for that because it's the nature of international relations that some country takes, so to say, subordinated position, the other countries take dominating positions. And but we should not compromise with our neighbors. We should defend this difference in our views on history and the other views, and especially with regard to our Polish neighbors. I think that this period of time would pass by, and a dialogue emerges, and a dialogue in which Ukraine is one of the equal partners, and Poland ceased to be our partner, as one of her previous presidents described Poland vis-à-vis Ukraine. But these relations would, I think, stabilize. But does this need for compromise encompass now also political issues, historical issues, not only economic issues? Because in 2014 we mainly thought, a lot of people thought that mostly economic issues were to be the subject of such dialogue. Well, it's obvious that there have been some rather dynamic changes, transformations in the recent years, very large transformations, but what hasn't changed was or is the fact that in Europe, and not only in Europe, they would respect the people who protect their history and who leave these things unaltered. And if we speak about Ukraine's war with Russia, I think that some of our neighboring countries perceive that as a weakness on the part of Ukraine. And in the matters of history, there are also these attempts at revising our history. And I think, on the other hand, that it might stimulate the need for the Ukrainians to revise their domestic policy, their historical views, and I'm sure that these pressures, outside pressures, they would not cause collapse, any collapse of Ukraine. And if we speak about our other neighboring countries, we could see that Russia, for example, insisted on some other post-Soviet countries to rewrite their new history books that were written after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Well, unfortunately for Ukraine, in Ukraine there has always been quite influential pro-Russian lobby, and before 2014 there were instances when the representatives of that pro-Russian lobby came to power, and in my view, the main question has been for Ukraine not what people would come to power, which people would come to power, but whether Ukraine would survive as a separate administrative entity. Well, we know that there is probably some information warfare on the part of Russia, but at the same time we can see that Russia is not trying to invent anything, to concoct some historical facts or views. It rather just points to the problems and contradictions that indeed exist in Ukraine. So we need to understand that on one hand there could be some exaggerations maybe, but on the other hand there are some real problems that are pointed to. Yes, I would agree that they are trying just to portray on a larger scale the existing problems. Undoubtedly, we need to pay attention to that, and we should understand, though, that if Russia tries to portray some problem as a big problem out of proportions, it does not mean that we should stop any efforts in this or the other direction or aspect. So we should follow within this, along this path of an independent country, and that, for example, law on the languages in Ukraine, many times it was mentioned that this law was divisive and it was practically limiting the rights of the national communities and national and ethnic groups in Ukraine. I'm sure that this law and the situation with the use of languages in Ukraine is the situation that we need to tackle in conjunction with decommunization. And some people were saying that if we pressure with introducing Ukrainian language more and more, it would bring about some split of the society. It hasn't happened. Well, if we leave Russia alone, we understand that after 25 years, there are some Russian speakers here in Ukraine that already say that when Russia is mentioned, they say that they do not know such a country. But if we speak about the other aspects, for example, of the functioning of the show business market, I am hopeful, and I think that our efforts have brought the results, that the Ukrainian language has been instilled more and more in Ukraine, and we should listen less to our liberal friends and those people who say that let the language develops by itself. It seems to me that it's like comparing a sportsman whose legs were broken and he was then made to take part in a sports contest, sports competition. As an historian, I am of the opinion that there has been Ukrainian language that has been, or there was the Ukrainian language that has been oppressed somehow, and in many respects. And what we need now is conscientious effort to protect Ukrainian language. So I think that we have already achieved a lot in this humanitarian realm, and in particular in the instillment of and rooting of Ukrainian language. Speaking about show business, I think that as the show business feels that it can develop in this Ukrainianized, so to say, space, and it can earn there, they would go there. Its representatives would go in that space. But what should we do else to continue these efforts? Well, I think that both radio and TV, they remain important instruments in forming, for the formation of our society, molding it, and I think that we need to improve the conditions for the creation of the Ukrainian language products, media products, or cultural products even. If some new clips, video clips, some new films are made in Ukrainian language, whatever the technical means of diffusing them, be it social media or internet or TV, I think it would be a success. There has been already a number of, or there have been already a number of discussions with regard to the quality of the cultural product manufactured in Ukraine. Well, there has been already, there have been a number of cases and discussions about that, and fair they were, many of them. Well, I think that we can use one of the laws of dialectic philosophy here, that the quantity would sooner or later grow into the quality. It hasn't happened so in Russia. Well, I think in Russia they have high-quality films that they demonstrate at the world or international level. What is lacking in Ukraine, I think that the Ukrainian state should create better conditions for the creation of this cultural product, rather than producing it itself by itself. When cinema turned into the medium of an ideological line, as it was called there in the Soviet time, that was dictated basically from the Kremlin, then the problems, some problems arose. But today we could see that in Russia they also have not necessarily patriotic films, just some comedies, blockbusters, whatever. And I'm sure that in this diversity, in Ukraine, similar diversity could be reached, and this diversity could result in Ukraine's ability to show its better sides to the world. So maybe we could, in parallel to our language law, adopt some new law on the use of English language that would enable us to participate in some joint projects with English-speaking, cultural and entertainment product manufacturers. It could be the case, for example, for a number of Ukrainian singers who can speak English. Well, as I told you already, Ukrainian language needs, in my view, some protections. English does not need any protections. English is being learned by many, and I'm not sure whether any specific law is needed there, but especially when we speak about the younger generation. There are no problems with regard to divulging, and spreading and advertising English language. And one more question, as we are discussing this post-Maidan period. How can we better use these mementos of the Maidan? Because people started forgetting about it. And for example, these sociopaths, so to say, who created graffiti during those events, they are practically somehow disappeared. So what could be the ways of restoring those memories? Well, we need to remember that nothing is done by itself. And if we want something to be done, we need to do something about it. And that also that concerns also the Maidan events and the memories of those events. And both in Ukraine and out of Ukraine, there is a lot of people who are interested in forgetting these events. And I think what we need to do is to institutionalize this memory of Maidan. And I'm very glad that Mr. Proshevalo, the director of the Museum of the Heavenly Hundred, is today present at this meeting. I think that in his hands the memories of Maidan are in reliable hands, and because it's our common legacy, and it's our duty not to only those who perished during those events, but also to the future generations. Any more questions any questions from the audience? Good afternoon. My name is Bontar Mikola. I'm from Kola Media. When your interview was shown, dating back to 2014, it was mentioned, separatism was mentioned. And thanks to your efforts, this term of separatism was launched. Yeah, I would agree with you that separatism is somewhat dubious, maybe incorrect, a term, and it was put into use because it was not understood what was the direction in which the country started moving. And separatism means that the desire to separate from one country and usually to unite to another country. But that word appeared, and we probably need to reformat it somehow. By the way, last week we published, I think, rather important material dedicated to the 5th anniversary of our war with the Russian Federation, where we also published the terminology that we promote, that we think should be used in order to describe these events, and it was quite difficult for us to compile this document, and there has been a lot of debates, and with regard to the memories of Maidan, also the memories of these facilities of this war has not yet been so to say, revisited. And I repeat all the time that we are not going to win this war if we do not admit the fact that it's a war. I recently watched an interview by Mr. Portnikov and also in a number of other pieces and feature programs. I have heard I have heard those definitions of how to describe, how to define the victory by the patriotic forces in Ukraine. But it was mentioned, the fact was mentioned that the patriotic forces could become more separate, more split, and as compared, for example, to Poland or to some other countries, to Israel, for example, Ukrainian patriotic forces seem to be more split. And what is to be done? Have we already passed that point when we were to get united, so to say, regardless of our political convictions and so on, in the name of Ukraine? Well, we should understand that Ukrainians would hardly be any monolithic, so to say, community or ethnicity. Ukrainians are markedly free-loving people up to anarchist, tendencies among them, as we know from our history. And it is important for us to be able to reach compromises, to agree in some critical moments, critical periods of our history. It's important for us to understand why we wanted to get together in 2014, and that's what, in my view, is lacking in our modern-day policy. For example, there is some split along the definitions of nationalism and democratic forces, nationalist forces. In my view, that could bring about the further split and defeat in this war. I once produced a film that was called The Thin Yellow and Blue Line, and that idea was supported also recently by Mr. Yevgen Bystritsky, who mentioned that both the upholding of democratic standards and Ukrainian national identity are necessary. One without the other is doomed to fail. And if we try to do something that is far beyond our national Ukrainian roots, even if it is democratic, it should become, somehow separated from our life and is not going to survive. If I may be a devil's advocate and ask you a question, that with these definitions, like the change of paradigm and similar definitions, we are just concealing certain problems. Like in Poland, for example, there was a meeting, or rather a competition, so to say, contest, or between a prime minister and the president of Poland, who had a lot of different conflicting points of view. But before going to Russia, they got together and agreed upon the main points that they were going to put forward while there. And in our conditions, for example, if we have this problem of the restoration or galvanization, so to say, of the memories of the heroes of Maidan. Maybe we should. It's not probably needed to make a law. It's probably is enough to for the people who participate in those events to get together and make a decision. Many of them are now in the government. Well, in my view, I think that the situation has been changing positively if we compare our today's level of integration of our political activists into the government if compared to the period right after the Orange Revolution. It has increased significantly, and if we go along these lines, I think we would progress and achieve better results. Thank you, Mr. Volodymyr, and it's time for us now to invite another speaker, who is Dmytro Kuleba.